Hi guys, my name is Kalechi Otu, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about the topic of URLs. Now, URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. Another common term for this are web addresses, but the proper word for it is Uniform Resource Locator or URL. Now, the URL is basically a string of characters that are arranged in a specific order, and it lets us find and access files, web pages, and other web resources that we can get from the World Wide Web. Now, no matter what browser that you're using, whether it be Internet Explorer or Google Chrome, you will come across a box that looks like this. It's normally near the top of the page. And what is in this box is usually the URL of the website that you're currently on. And sometimes, or most of the times, it lets you put in the URL of the website or of files that you want to have access to on the World Wide Web. Now, in order to fully grasp what a URL is and the concept of it, you must first understand the basic workings of the internet. And I'll just take a few moments to explain them right now. So basically, the internet is a global system of interconnected computer devices, whether these devices are laptops, desktops, tablets, phones, it doesn't matter, but as long as they're computer devices and they're connected either using physical wires or more popularly, they're connected with a wireless connection. Now, the purpose of the internet is to allow these computers to interact with each other and to allow them to share and transfer files. So, I'm going to give you guys a little demonstration. We're going to demonstrate using web pages. Now, every web page you see online is actually a text file known as a HTML. And every website or web page that is online is a text file which is stored on a computer somewhere in the world. Now, let's say this is a computer and you have a web page, the text file is stored in here. Now, let's say you have your own personal computer device. This is your personal computer. And let's say your personal computer wants to visit that website. It wants to have that website show up. So what it does is your personal device connects with this computer where the text file is, and it connects using the internet. So that now that they are connected, as you can see, there is now a link between the two devices. Now, what your personal device does is it sends a request through the internet to the computer which has the text file of the website. And if that request is valid, then this computer that has the text file using the internet once again will send back a response. Now, the response will usually be the HTML file for the web page that you requested. And what happens is when it sends this file back to your computer, your web browser reads it and it turns it into the web page that you can see in front of you. And just to clear things up, the device which asks for which sends a request is known as the client, and the device which receives the request and sends back a response is known as a server. Now, this is basically how it works for everything, not just web pages. You can also use it to explain other things like when you download PDFs or movies and stuff like that online. What you're basically doing is your computer sends a request to download to get a specific file from a server, and then that server, if it's a valid request, will send back that file, and your computer says that it's downloading. That's basically what downloading is. And it can also be used for all different other concepts like the cloud on your iPhones. When you save pictures, movies, and other files on the cloud, what you're basically doing is you're sending those files and you're saving them on a server which is owned by Microsoft or Apple somewhere in the world. And whenever you want to visit those files, those pictures, what you do is you send a request through the internet to that server, and it sends you back those pictures to your phone, iPad, whatever it is, those movies. It sends it and it allows you to see them. And that's the basic concept of how the internet is a way that two computers can interact. Now, the only problem with this is there are literally billions of computer devices all over the world. So, how does your personal computer know which server has the website that you want to visit or the web page, or which server has the file that you want to get from the internet? And this is where URLs come in, and it helps the personal computer you have locate this server. I should also add that a server may have multiple different types of files on it, and it may have those files saved in different locations depending on what types of files they are and who they belong to. So a URL also helps not just to find the server, but it helps to find the specific file that you want in the server. So there are many types of URLs that exist, but the most popular and by far the most common type of URL is the HTTP type of URL. And the HTTP stands for Hyper Text Transfer Protocol. And this is the most popular type of URL by far. And a basic example of that I just came up with is this URL that I came up with for the Moodle course page. And as you can see, there are many different components of a URL, but I'm only going to talk about the essential components that you need. because there are a lot of advanced stuff that are very complicated. But this is just the basics. So the basic components of a URL are, first of all, the protocol. Then there's the host, and then there's the port, and lastly, of the essential components you need, there is the path. Just so you're not confused, the colons and dashes that are in between the components, the different components, they're basically just there to tell the browser, it is there to tell the components apart from each other. So it knows that this is the protocol, and after a semicolon and two dashes, then there's the host, and after the after a colon again, there's the port, and after a dash, there's the path. So the symbols there are basically just to tell the components apart so your browser can read it, the individual components by themselves. So now I will explain the individual components of the URL. The first component we're going to talk about is the protocol. Some people call it the scheme as well, but its actual name is the protocol. And the protocol is basically what type of URL is this URL. So we can say that from our example, we know that it's a HTTP type. And what this basically means is that the other components in the URL need to be arranged in a specific way. Now, the HTTP type of URL, the components have to be arranged in host, port, and then path in that order. In a different type of URL, let's say ICP, it might have other components in it, which have to be in front of these components. So the order may be very different in a different type of URL. But by writing HTTP first, it basically tells your browser that it should expect the other components to be in this order. So now we're going to talk about the host component of the URL. Now, to understand this part, you need to understand that every server in the world, as soon as it's connected to the internet or the World Wide Web, it's given a unique series of numbers. Now, this unique series of numbers will look something like this. Not exactly everyone has a different one because they're all unique, but you will have something that looks like this. It's like a telephone number for every server. Now, this is known as the IP address, and you'd realize that there is nowhere on the URL that has the IP address. Instead, there's a www.moodle.yourq.ca. Now, if you replace this with the IP address, you'd still get the exact same website. But the reason why it has a moodle.ca instead of the IP address is because this is much more easier to remember. Think about the amount of websites that you go on every day. It would be really difficult if every time you want to change a website, you have to memorize the IP address of the server which has the website files on it. It would be difficult to remember all of them. So instead, it's much more easier to assign this IP address a domain name like moodle.co.ca so that people can remember it much easier. So now we are going to talk about the port number. Now, the port number here, the port is basically a location on the server, which is for organization purposes. Now, the port is meant to house different services in a server. So, for example, if you have a company like Google that has different services that they offer, you if you go on Google server, you would find out that maybe they have port 80, which we'll call this port, this location of the server, will be dedicated to, let's say, Google Mail or Gmail. And you have another port, let's call it port 50 in Google server, which is dedicated to the Google search engine, is where all the files for Google search engine are kept. And let's say you have another port in the Google server dedicated for the files of Google Plus. So all those different services are better organized when you put them into different ports. It makes it easier to know which one is in which. Now, many people consider the port to be part of the host, and many people consider them to be different, but it really depends on the context of the situation. So, the reason for this is that servers are very expensive. So, when you have a, a server, you might find out that there are multiple websites that are sharing the exact same server. And you find out that on a server which has this IP address, you might find out on port 1, that is where the files for, let's say, eng.com are kept. Now, for the same IP address of that same server on port 2, you might find out that another website, eecs.com, keeps all of its files on port 2. Those are two different services, two different websites, but they're sharing the same server, so they're on two different ports. Now, the reason people think that the port is part of the host is when you write eng.com, you don't need to write 80 or 50 because it already knows that eng.com, that domain name, is already allocated to the IP address, this port 1. And it knows that when you write ECS is the same IP address, but port 2. So when you put all of these components together and you write them in that box on your browser, what your browser basically does, as we said before, it sends it out and it knows that it needs to go to port 80 and get this file, and the server will get it for you and send it right back, and your browser will basically just make that into a web page that you can visually see. So for people who still don't grasp the concept, it's like if your friend is calling you from a room in their apartment and your friend said, "Oh, come and visit me right now." If you wanted to go see your friend, you would have to ask him for the address of his apartment building, and you would have to ask him the apartment number, the number of his apartment, and then you would have to ask him the room he's in and how to get to that room in order for you to come and see him. So it's the same basic type of concept that a URL also works with. So that's basically the concept of a uniform resource locator or URL. Thank you guys for listening. I'm sorry I don't have I shot this from my phone, so I don't have a tripod. So I'm sorry if it was a bit shaky and out of focus. But thank you for listening. Bye.